From the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University in Houston, Texas, this is Baker Briefing. I'm Ambassador David Satterfield. Baker Briefing is a podcast that tackles the most critical foreign and domestic policy issues of the day. Through conversations with subject matter experts, we seek to provide meaningful analysis and independent perspective. Each episode is recorded in front of a live audience at Rice University in Houston. Today's topic: surging immigration at the U.S. Mexico border and President Biden's policy response. Our discussants today will be Payan and Kelsey Norman, both focused on the combined topics of the broad U.S. Mexico relationship as well as migration. And I'm going to start off with a bit of the obvious. With record-breaking apprehensions by U.S. authorities at the southern border, over 2.3 million by the end of 2022, the unprecedented surge of migration to the Americas has become a defining feature, like it or not, of the U.S.-Mexico relationship. Tony, first let's discuss President Joe Biden's recent visit to El Paso. This was his first time visiting the U.S.-Mexico border since taking office. Why is this on his agenda right now?
Well, there's been a surge in the number of immigrants over the last few years. This is not new, by the way. This began around 2012 or so with the caravanization of immigration, that is thousands of immigrants marching north. So it's transcended this administration. It was obviously a problem for the Obama administration, it was a problem for the Trump administration, and it is a problem for the Biden administration. But the Biden administration in the beginning sought to break with some of the policies of the Trump administration. They really didn't. They continued to have the problem nonetheless. Hundreds of thousands of people showing up at the border every single month. And there was a perception that the president was neglecting the problem. And it was time for him to go to the border. There was a clamor that he visit the border, particularly after the surge in El Paso, Texas, where I actually visited over the Christmas break. I looked at the hundreds, thousands of immigrants milling around downtown El Paso. I looked at the tents on the riverbed, on the Rio Grande. I mean, I personally observed what was going on, and I think those communities were stressed. They had to house them, they had to feed them, they had to process them. It was very, very chaotic, and I remember thinking that it probably was not sustainable, and the president could no longer postpone a visit to see what really was going on the ground.
Tony, just a factual question. The migrants crossing in 2022, Mexican, non-Mexican? What are the trend lines here?
28% of them are Mexican, and evidently Mexicans do not necessarily qualify for asylum. It's very, very hard. Mexicans are mostly apprehended and then sent right back to Mexico. The rest of them are essentially four nationalities. Cubans. Cuba lost 2.5% of its population last year. Cubans are leaving that country in droves. Haitians, where there is a failed state, it's run by gangs and people cannot really live there. It's a very difficult situation. Of course, Venezuela. Venezuela had, just a few years ago, 35 million people. It's down to 25 million. Almost 10 million Venezuelans have left that country. And of course, Nicaragua, where the situation is deteriorating very quickly. So most of them are these four nationalities, all of them going through Mexico, almost like a funnel, through Mexico and right up to the U.S. Mexico border.
Now, Kelsey, the Department of Homeland Security also announced a new set of policies which limit humanitarian parole visas to 30,000 migrants per month from exactly those four countries to enter the U.S. and be able to work legally for up to 2 years. They have to apply from their home country, not at the border, not in the U.S., and they have to find someone who can provide financial support in the U.S. There's also an expansion of the use of the emergency health order known as Title 42 to expel the same number of migrants from those four countries back to Mexico if they attempt to enter the U.S. illegally. And according to Homeland Security, Mexico has agreed to accept up to 30,000 migrants a month from those countries under 42. Why issue these rules now? What do they hope to accomplish? How does this impact migrants and the political question? How does this respond to the increasingly prominent and vocal demands from Republicans, including Governors Abbott and DeSantis, for steps on the border?
All very important questions. So let me just address something that Tony picked up on. So these four nationalities, the reason why President Biden is addressing those four particular nationalities now is because indeed they are those who had been able to cross the border. But it's not to say that they're the only ones who had been showing up at the border. They were just those who hadn't previously been able to be expelled under Title 42. So individuals from El Salvador or other Central American countries could be expelled back to Mexico under Title 42.
What is Title 42?
So Title 42 is a fairly antiquated public health law that former President Trump invoked in 2020 at the beginning of the pandemic. So it's related, again, to public health, not to immigration. But because it was in place, it effectively closed our border to individuals trying to seek asylum, which, again, is a legal process. That's something that individuals who come to a port of entry have the right to do. If they claim to fear persecution in their home countries, they can begin this process whereby they should be allowed to remain in the United States until their asylum claims are processed. But Title 42 effectively prevented that process from occurring, and certain nationalities were able to be sent back to Mexico, including Mexicans themselves, and forced to remain in Mexico or to try to go elsewhere instead of seeking asylum in the US. So prior to this recent decision by President Biden to add further nationalities to those that could be expelled under Title 42, those individuals were able to come and begin that process in the US. But now those four nationalities can also be sent back to Mexico, or at least 30,000 a month can.
We see the impact on migrants that you've just described. But what's the impact on the overall flow of individuals to and across the border? Does this have any real impact on the very significant numbers we saw in 2022? Tony?
Not really. In fact, the numbers don't really add up, and I'll tell you why. The United States has said that it will take in about 30,000 into the United States. It'll parole them into the United States and then allow them to present themselves before an immigration judge to make their case for asylum, which, by the way, are being denied at a very high rate, 95, and even in some courts, like here in Houston, 100% of cases are being denied. So that's one thing. And then Mexico said, I'll take another 30. But there's 250,000 showing up every single month. So what's going to happen to the other 180,000, 190,000? I don't think the numbers add up. Now, obviously, the Biden administration had to send a warning to all immigrants and say, you have to stay home and try to get asylum at home in those countries, wherever they may be. If you come to Mexico, through Mexico and onto the border, and if you cross without the proper authorization, you will be disqualified from ever applying for asylum again. But still, these people are going to keep coming. This doesn't solve the situation in those countries, and so those people, I think, will keep coming. The numbers just don't add up, in my view.
Yeah, if I can just add, the 30,000 a month from those four nationalities that are going to have the opportunity to apply for humanitarian parole are not the same sort of background of individuals that are showing up at the border. Those are people that are going to have the resources and the family connections in the US. They're going to be able to afford a plane ticket here. These are individuals who are already fairly privileged. Those that have to go through really dangerous routes and come and try to seek asylum at a port of entry are not those same individuals that would have those resources. So this isn't actually addressing the problem of people showing up at the border.
Kelsey, what is the transit ban that we understand will be the subject of new federal government regulations issued at some point in coming months?
So we don't know exactly yet, but speculation is that it would be something similar in principle to what former President Trump tried to utilize during his presidency. He basically established these agreements with a number of Central American countries whereby if an individual leaves their home country, let's say Guatemala, and has to transit then through Mexico to come to the US to seek asylum here, that individual could be sent back to Mexico because they should have first tried to seek asylum in Mexico. So it's trying to enforce this idea of a safe third country, that you have to apply for asylum in the first country you pass through and not in the US.
Okay, Tony, just a week ago, President Biden met with Mexico's President, López Obrador. They talked about a great many issues, including these topics of migrants coming into and through Mexico and then up to and across the U.S. border. In many ways, this is both a U.S. and a Mexican border problem. Different borders, but a similar problem. What is Mexico doing? Is there a way to have effective cooperation with the government of Mexico on this issue?
I think it's very difficult, and there's a couple of answers to that question. At one level, I think we have to think about Mexico using the immigration issue as a leverage against the United States so that the U.S. not act in regards to energy, which is a component of the Mexican economy that they're trying to close to foreign investment and sort of re-centralize in the hands of the state. And the U.S. and Canada are obviously protesting that because they believe the USMCA protects investment in the energy sector. So it's a nationalistic project. And then, of course, they're using that because the López Obrador administration has this abrazos no balazos, or hugs not bullets strategy against organized crime, or rather no strategy against organized crime. And we're obviously having a huge problem with fentanyl in the United States, almost all of it coming from Mexico, very easy to smuggle and so on. So Mexico is not doing its part on a number of binational issues and using the immigration leverage, because the Biden administration, I think it's desperate to figure out a way to solve this issue. And so they're willing to give Mexico a pass on these other issues in exchange for their help on immigration. The problem I see, and this is the second level, is that it's not working. Why? Because if it were working, we would see the numbers go down, and the numbers have only gone up. So whatever they agree to is simply not having the intended effect. And I think that Biden is not really getting from Mexico what is required. And there's one more component on that. There's a lot of corruption in Mexico, and we have to acknowledge that. Organized crime is actively participating in human smuggling and human trafficking in Mexico, through Mexico, and the Mexican authorities that are supposed to implement the strategy on the ground, for example, INAMI, the National Immigration Institute, they surely are on the take from organized crime to look the other way and let a lot of these immigrants through Mexico. So the president doesn't have control over his own bureaucracy. He is unable to fulfill his promises to the Biden administration, and the Biden administration is now really, in my view, in a desperate situation.
So what you're saying, Tony, is that the government of Mexico, even were it willing and interested in restricting this migration into and through Mexico, is unable to do it as an effective matter.
That is correct. I think Mexico cannot fulfill that promise. Evidently, border communities are also overwhelmed. I mean, I was in Ciudad Juarez, I was in Tijuana, I've been to South Texas and Tamaulipas, and I can tell you the shelters there are full. People are milling around in Mexican border towns as well, and they can't do very much. They really just cannot do anything. They're also as overwhelmed as the U.S. government is, particularly because they refuse to seal the southern border, establish an orderly process to come in and transit through Mexico, and agree a way to process them in Mexican territory into the United States.
So, Kelsey, if some of the root means of dealing with this trafficked migration aren't or can't be made to work, self-help is being turned to by individual U.S. states, by individual members of the U.S. Congress. What effect do these have? Can you deal with this problem by providing help, for example, to New York State?
Well, if you're referring to some of the sort of political stunts, especially from Republican governors, for example, DeSantis flying Venezuelans to, I can't remember if it was Martha's Vineyard or Nantucket, but one of the islands, the rich, wealthy, liberal islands in the Northeast, or Abbott proposing to do the same, I think those types of acts are only going to have a deleterious effects both for migrants themselves but also for this issue overall. I think that there is some truth to needing to sort of share the quote-unquote burden of hosting asylum seekers. Obviously, Texas is a very heavily impacted state, as Tony has described, in El Paso. But there are means to do that that don't involve just shipping people off to where there are no resources. And there's groups out there, civil society organizations, other democratic states in particular, that are willing to receive more individuals, but this can be done in an orderly process. It doesn't need to be this political stunt, as we've seen from particular Republican governors.
And Tony, on a nonpartisan basis, looking purely at economics, business, and markets in Mexico and in the U.S., particularly border states, what do those states, in a business sense, want? Do they need continued flow of workers? Do they need continued flow of migrants? If so, what kind of migrants and what kind of flows?
You know, this is the interesting paradox that you speak to the business community in Texas, you speak to the business community in California or in Arizona or in different states, and they all will tell you the same thing. We need workers. The United States is in an incredible position of really a structural labor shortage. All the baby boomers are retiring by the tens of thousands. Everybody's leaving. We saw the great quitting during the pandemic. Lots of industries need these kinds of workers. Some are lesser skilled. I don't think there are unskilled immigrants, by the way. They can be very readily trained for agriculture and for construction and for landscaping, and certainly higher skilled for healthcare and such. And so we need the workers. But there is a bottleneck. We can't figure out the visa pathways to allow these people to come in, and we do need them. I think the United States can easily absorb another 10 million people, because that is the estimated labor shortage in the United States. At least it was before. We're now expecting a recession perhaps in 2023, but people spoke about 10 million vacancies in the labor market. So the jobs are here, the immigrants are there, the visa pathways are simply not there.
Tony, because all of these terms are politically laden and hot, absorb effectively guest workers who are here in a legitimate status, contributing to the U.S. economy, paying taxes or whatever obligations there may be, but not citizens, and then returning at some point back to their home countries? Or are you looking at naturalization as the end goal for these folks?
Well, you're asking a very tough question. I think we've been struggling with that since the 1990s. I mean, there's been several opportunities to pass immigration reform in this country, to create new visa pathways and new, qualification lists for different immigrants. Congress has been unable to act. The last time Congress actually legislated, I think, was 1996, IRCA at that time. So we're almost 30 years into that particular bill. Nothing has been done. The Republicans are not really resisting the temptation to use their newfound power in the House to harass the business administration instead of getting to look at the problems seriously. And Kelsey said it. Governor Abbott went up to El Paso. I was there when Biden visited the city, and he handed over what exactly? A petition that included building the wall. And to me, the wall doesn't make any sense, because these immigrants are not trying to sneak into the United States between ports of entry or jumping over the fence. They're actually turning themselves in. They want to be paroled into the country and given a permit to work. There is the possibility. Look, if you look at agriculture, for example, if I recall the numbers correctly, the United States has about 180 to 200,000 agricultural visas for guest workers. The administration, the Trump administration and the Biden administration, have actually had to, from their own executive powers, lift that cap. And today, there's almost 300,000 of those agricultural workers, because we need them. The agricultural industry in the United States wants more of those workers, but they can only do so much. So we obviously have space and room in our economy and in the country for those workers, but it needs to go through Congress. They need to create the entry points.
And to clarify for our listeners, are we still talking, as much of the debate is structured about, quote, Mexicans, close quote, or are we really talking about Mexicans plus those coming out of the various states, the four in particular that we discussed earlier?
I think to address the broad issues, not just worker shortages, and not just the arrivals of individuals at the border, but individuals trying to come to this country through whatever legal means are available as well, we're talking about much more than just Mexican nationals. If we want to address, as you called them earlier, the root causes, we're going to have to be much broader in our thinking about legal pathways for people to come to this country, whether it's through expansion of working opportunities, whether through expansion of family reunification opportunities, whether it's through guest worker programs or expanding the refugee resettlement program. There's so many legal pathways that could get people here, but as Tony said as well, it's also a congressional issue. This is not something that just the executive branch can do.
I'll offer a summary observation from my own conversations with current and former U.S. officials, for whom this is their focus. There's been too much of an attempt to manage the issue, not to address fundamentally and structurally the challenges posed by this phenomenon of 2.3 million migrants coming across, with, I take it from both of you, no indication this is going to, the demand signal or the impetus to leave will diminish in 2023.
It's not going to change. The conditions in those countries are not going to change. And the U.S. is truly in a very difficult position, and I'll tell you why. When the United States has a very active foreign policy in Latin America, in Central America, even in regards to Nicaragua, El Salvador, Honduras, or Guatemala, in regards to Mexico, or even beyond, Latin Americans complain quite a bit that the U.S. is essentially meddling in their affairs and being overbearing and on and on. But the López Obrador administration, during the North American Leaders Summit last week, said the U.S. has abandoned Latin America. And of course, President Biden said, hey, we've invested money in Latin America, we allow a number of Latin Americans in, and he tried to defend himself and his policies before the López Obrador administration. But I found that kind of curious and paradoxical, because when the U.S. is absent, that's a problem. And when the U.S. is too engaged, that's a problem. So at the end of the day, I don't think Washington can win.
Trust me, this is not a phenomenon unique to Latin America.
Right.
It's a global problem. Kelsey, concluding comments?
I just want to add an accounting point that I think is important to note in terms of the numbers that we've been discussing. CBP and DHS changed their accounting in 2020 to include both apprehensions and deportations under Title 42. So partly the numbers we're seeing are inflated as a result of how many people have been expelled from the U.S. under Title 42. So we are, as Tony said earlier, in a peak that is higher than 2019, but the numbers that we're seeing that are being repeated again and again in the news are not actually as sort of alarming as the 2 million.
And Kelsey, a final takeaway question for you. The Biden administration, the Trump administration, Title 42, any change?
I'd say the Biden administration is looking a lot like the Trump administration these days, and has continued to basically since it came into office on this issue.
But Tony, last remarks?
Absolutely. I think the Biden administration is in a very difficult position. It needs Mexico to operate this problem, to solve this problem. It needs Mexico to do its part. And that's, I think, where they're caught, between having to put up with other issues that are important, like the war on drugs, the fentanyl issue, the implementation of USMCA, border management, a number of important issues. And they're having to say, we'll look the other way if you can just help us on the issue of immigration.
But 2024 is coming.
In both countries, by the way.
In both countries, there are elections. Any real changes you expect on the Mexican side?
Well, I'm not certain. In fact, I think it's up in the air. I mean, obviously, the López Obrador administration is practically a failure. It's not delivered on inequality and poverty. More Mexicans are leaving Mexico. In fact, just a few years ago, we were talking about zero or net zero or even negative Mexican migration. It's now reversed. More Mexicans are leaving, 28% of those numbers, although they're inflated, as Kelsey just said. And of course, he has not delivered on economic growth, not delivered on security, not delivered on almost anything. And so we should expect things in Mexico to get really, really rough. And we have to watch the middle class. It'll be the year for the middle class to act in Mexico. They may just bring regime change, but we'll have to wait.
Great. Thank you both, and thank all of you listening. Baker Briefing is brought to you by the team at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. This episode was produced by Victoria Jupp, Shannon Moriarty, and Ben Stevenson. AV production was provided by Kevin Young. Logistics support was provided by Jean Ard, Star Dickerson, Rachel Smith, and Macy Stewart. Many thanks to the Baker Institute interns who assisted with this episode: Maya Adkihari, Sarah Davidson, and George Ruthven. The Baker Institute for Public Policy provides meaningful policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing Texas, the U.S., and the world. It is a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy research organization based at Rice University in Houston, Texas. To learn more, including how you can attend a live podcast recording on the campus of Rice, visit us at bakerinstitute.org. Thank you for listening.